technology, artificial intelligence, and robotics. As president of Merits Motivation, Drew is committed to leveraging science, technology, and data to deliver actionable behavior insights, empowering clients to lead change in their industries. Drew has spent more than 20 years in senior advisory and executive roles, transforming some of the largest companies in the world, and has been named by Incentive Magazine as one of the most influential leaders in the incentive and recognition industry. Drew has a Bachelor of Science degree in accounting and business management from the University of Kansas, in addition to a Master's of Business Administration from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Sue Heitz will now provide a brief overview of the webinar format before turning it over to Drew for his presentation. Sue?
Thanks, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. And I just want to say, just a brief kind of off topic is, it's been 6 months since we've seen you guys, and I really miss seeing all the faces. I was looking at everyone that was signing in and registering, and just a quick shout out to everyone that we aren't able to shake your hand and give a hug to, but we miss you. We will be back soon. And as far as the question and answer section goes, presentation today is going to last for about 60 minutes total, 45-minute presentation, and then 15 minutes for Q&A. And we will be sending out a survey at the very end. We really appreciate your feedback. To submit your questions, if you go to the toolbar and expand the toolbar where it says questions, just go ahead and type in your questions, and I will pop back on at the end and answer your questions. And just a little bit of housekeeping, you can see us, but we cannot see you, and everyone has been muted for this presentation. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Drew and let him kick things off. Drew?
Great. Thank you, Sue and Steve. It's nice to get to spend some time with this group, and thank you to UHY for the opportunity to speak to the group. So as Steve said, I run a company in St. Louis, Missouri called Merits Motivation, and I'm not here as a representative of that company. A bit of my hobby and my past is focusing on digital transformation and disruption, business disruption. So my goal here is really just to share a point of view, maybe provide some data points that are new or provocative to help each of you become more competitive on a global stage, and to identify and plan for competition and disruption that you may have a hard time observing, because we all do. And I'll tell you why. I've got 3 reasons why digital transformation and business disruption is hard to observe and hard to see coming if you're not really looking for it. So the first reason is that as we're swimming across the lake or the ocean, disruption comes at us from a different angle. Typically, if you're a large incumbent, it comes at you from some small startup that you may have even known about, but sort of dismissed because they were too small, too far behind. But all of a sudden they ramp up, and it feels like overnight are a real competitor taking business. So the challenge is that just identifying disruption is problematic, because it's typically not right in the middle of our swim lane. It comes from angles that we don't expect. Okay, we can go to number 2. We're just bad at predicting the future. And this comes from a number of complications in the way our brains are put together. So we all, if you think about the way you plan year to year for your financial statements or your business performance, the vast majority of us look at last year and add some percentage growth rate. I'm going to grow 5 or 10 or 20 or whatever percent growth based on what I did last year. And basically, we're taking a linear approach. I'm going to take last year and apply some sort of reasonable growth rate, and that works a lot of the time. But there's a portion of the time that doesn't work, and that's when we're having some sort of change in our competitive space. So as an example of that, AT&T asked McKinsey to give them a prediction in 1985 of what the cell phone market would look like in the year 2000. So their prediction, sure, if you click through, was 900,000. They said there would be 900,000 cell phone users. And so really AT&T, I'm not sure this is a business you want to get into. The actual number, you're probably thinking, what was that? 109 million. So they were off a little bit. I would say it's almost like saying there would be zero when there were 109 million. And a big part of that is getting out of this linear prediction model to something else, like an exponential or geometric change factor. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. Let's go on. As we look into the past and history, there have been a number of really interesting sort of quotes that have become a little embarrassing. And I just put a few of these up here. Things like, if you look at the second to last in 2005, Steve Chen, who was the co-founder of YouTube, was quoted that there's just not that many videos I want to watch. So he's kind of thinking about the future of his business. Makes me a little anxious if the founder of the company isn't sure of the value of his own company. Luckily, he was wrong. Luckily for Google, anyways. And I love the quote at the very end from David Pogue of the New York Times, mentioning that Apple will probably never come out with a cell phone. It was in early 2007, months later, that Apple came out with one of the most revolutionary digital devices, in the past 20 years. So no matter what your expertise level, the point is, no matter how embedded you are in the industry, even if you're an insider and an expert, you can still be vastly wrong in the way you try to predict what's happening. Let's go on. So exponential change is happening now. And exponential is a term that gets used a lot, but it's kind of hard to internalize. What does exponential change really mean? So think about this little example. Let's pretend we're all scientists for a moment, and we're going to make some bacteria. So here's the facts are that the process will take 4 hours. And we're going to produce 1,000 milliliters of bacteria beginning at 8 a.m. So the question is, if you think about exponential growth, with this volume doubling every second, when we are 3 hours, 59 minutes, and 55 seconds into the process, what percent of our goal of 1,000 milliliters will we have produced? And the answer is 3%. And so at what time does our beaker contain half our goal of 500 milliliters? And the answer is at 11:59 and 59 seconds. So the point there, sorry about that. The point there is that exponential change sneaks up on us. And as you can see here, if you go through 3 hours and 59 minutes and 55 seconds, gosh, it feels like super slow progress. It feels like we are never going to get there. And it feels like something you can ignore, and up until you cannot ignore it. And that's what happens with a lot of disruption. Companies feel like they come out of nowhere. Facebook, gosh, seemed like they came out of nowhere and all of a sudden they had 1 billion users. It was actually a long haul. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. You've probably heard of Moore's Law, which is, we talk about it being a doubling. It's actually a 4x growth in the functionality of computing systems, but this has been going on for quite some time. So this is from Ray Kurzweil, this chart. For over 100 years, we've been in this exponential growth in computing power. And if you look at the scale on the left, the vertical axis is a linear scale would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, blah, blah, blah. A log scale goes 1, 10, 100, 1,000. This is a double log because the curve ramps up so swiftly that a linear function, it would just look like it goes up. A log function, it still curves up quite dramatically. So you have to double log that to try to estimate a straight line. at a 45-degree angle, and it still is curving up. The point here is that we've been going through exponential growth for quite some time, but early on it was really hard to identify. Today, it's a little bit easier to identify, but when you're in the moment, it's still hard to identify this disruption. So let's go on. Lots of growth happening. So if you think about the last century being 100 years of progress, let's say 1920 to 2019, how much progress will we make in the next 100 years? Let's say from 2020 to 2119 in years of progress. So if the last 100 years was 100 years of progress, what will be the comparable rate of progress we make in the next 100 years? So feel free to enter your poll answer. And when Sherry tells me I can see the voting happening. So I didn't mean this as a math test for everyone. And Sherry, I'll let you tell me when we're finished with the voting.
Okay, I'm going to close it now.
All right.
Sure.
Yes, E was the correct answer. 20,000 years of progress compared to the last 100. And my point there is it's very hard to use history to project the future when you're going through so much disruption. All right, we can click back into our presentation. And let's roll on. Sherry, I'm seeing the poll. Can we go past that? There we go. Okay, thank you. So I present this type of material. I presented this a number of times in the past, and so recently, like you, my world has been completely disrupted by the CV-19 pandemic. So I've included thoughts and considerations around the pandemic and what's going to happen, and I would suggest we have kind of 3 time frames that matter. There's managing through 2020. As the year goes on, that becomes less important, but we've still got, another 4 or 5 months of trying to manage through a very unpredictable time. The second time frame is adapting for sustainability. So what does this mean to our businesses in the next 18 months? And then there's the 24 months plus of, well, can I capture opportunity in this? So let's go through. We'll talk about each one of these, but we'll start with the near term and we'll work our way through a little bit longer term. Okay, we can keep going. So here's a point of view that I liked from McKinsey. They took a few industries and said, all right, well, what's going to be the impact? And you can chart yourself. If you're a large corporation, you're in the gray/black. If you're small and medium, you're in the blues. And this is your likelihood to default, right? To face such serious economic strain that you would default, potentially go into like a bankruptcy scenario. So if you're in the airline business, for example, passenger transport, and you're a large company like United Airlines, you got problems. 16 times more likely to default. If you are, in the automotive sector, you've still got twice the likelihood of default as prior to the pandemic, but you're doing better than many of the others. Interestingly, if you're in real estate as a large corporation, you could probably withstand the pandemic, but if you're one of the smaller independent providers that there are so many of, you've got bigger problems. I've got a breakout on the right of this auto area because I talk about autos a little bit regarding disruption. And what's interesting is the maintenance and repair of cars, light trucks, and motorcycles, I think will improve, but the manufacture and sale of them is really going to be hurt over the next probably 24 months, maybe even longer. So let's keep going. If you've heard of the 4th industrial revolution, pardon me, if you think back to the end of the 18th century, as we're moving out of predominantly an agrarian economy, with the Industrial Revolution, that was one. We had a second industrial revolution sort of characterized by Henry Ford and mass production. We had a third industrial revolution around software and IT systems from the 70s through really the aughts. And now we're moving into what I would suggest is potentially the fourth industrial revolution. And it's really around artificial intelligence and autonomous automation. And I'll get into more what I mean about that. Okay, let's keep rolling. So as a business leader, I facing a pandemic and both opportunities and threats within that, I find that I cannot rely on pre-crisis management techniques alone. As an aside, I used to work in a firm that focused on crisis management and digital disruption and whatnot within that crisis management scenario. And what is clear, what has been proven out, is that the command and control management style may work in a non-crisis time, but it does not work during a crisis. You need to empower people, lieutenants in the field, to make more decisions, because in a crisis, you have less historical knowledge to rely upon, and you have a greater need for speed and clarity. So the scenario planning process, I find a very helpful process to try to create some of that knowledge base so I can make decisions based on new information, because we're getting new information all the time. Estimates of the economy reopening, the infection rate, all this stuff changes, I feel like, on a daily basis. So I use scenario planning to try to create a system of thinking that prepares me for eventualities, because it's easy to not think about the things that seem unlikely, and yet in a crisis, it's hard to judge the likelihood. It's hard to assign a probability to any specific outcome. Okay, let's keep going. Let's put this into action a little bit as we think about the pandemic and the potential outcome of the pandemic in the short term, meaning in the next 6 to 18 months. I would suggest there are two axes that we could think about. The horizontal axis, side to side, is on the left, we have continued infections globally, or you can think about the US. And on the right is eradication, let's say US based, because eradication will be vastly different throughout the world. So eradication would mean, great, we have identified a vaccine, distributed it, we don't have a big anti-vaxxer problem, and we create herd immunity and can eradicate the disease. And obviously continued infections is the opposite. If you look at the vertical axis, we have thriving economies at the top and struggling economies at the bottom. So this obviously creates 4 quadrants. Upper right corner, we have eradication and a thriving economy. We kind of get back to normal. Normal, I should have put in quotes, because who knows what back to normal actually means. Does back to normal mean everything is like it was prior to the crisis? I highly doubt that. But back to normal might mean our businesses are operating, we're traveling to the extent we want to, and we're not curtailed in our activities, no more social distancing and things like that. That does not seem very likely, especially right now, as continued infections continues to be the state of the world. If you stay on eradication, though, stay on that right side and go to the bottom right, we've eradicated the disease, but our economy has been so damaged that we are safe but hungry. So there's not a chicken in every pot. We've eradicated the disease, but there's high unemployment, wages are stagnant, productivity growth is low. Let's look at the left side. We do not eradicate the virus, which feels a little bit more like what's happening today, but the economy is thriving, which feels a little bit like what's going on with the stock market, approaching new highs on feels like a weekly basis. So the upper left is this VIP scenario where we are continuing to fight infections, continuing to have this roller coaster of constraints, social distancing, face masks, all that. And this really increases the class divisions. Those who can afford to do things do and pay more for them, but so many cannot and suffer from that. That's in a thriving economy. If you go to the lower left, it's just worse. Everyone is suffering, or almost everyone is suffering. The economy is damaged badly, and we continue to fight infections. So I, of course, do not know which one of these will be more the case, more representative of the case. It feels like the two left scenarios seem a little bit more likely than the right, and it's hard to tell top or bottom. Hopefully, it's closer to the top than the bottom. Okay, let's go on. So as we think about what's happening in the world, we've got four of the five largest companies really trade in data. So now I'm moving a little bit into the broader economic impacts, more than 6 months away, maybe more than 12 months away. What should we be thinking about as we eventually emerge from the crisis, as a vaccine is eventually available? And outside Saudi Aramco, which is the fifth of the five largest companies, all these companies deal in data and insights. So to the extent your company has the option to trade in data, to provide insights, think seriously about that. Because almost every company that I have encountered does a terrible job in monetizing their data. There are exceptions, like these companies, but most others just don't harvest the assets that they have. And the firm I used to work for worked with Kodak, right? The company that invented the digital camera and then watched that industry consume their own company because they weren't able to figure out how to monetize that for fear of crushing their own film business. Let's keep going. So we have payment systems, changing the way we think about value. So Libra is the currency or the value marker that Facebook has been suggesting. It's taken a beating from regulators and whatnot, fearing that Facebook will create its own currency and therefore avoid a lot of government regulation. But as clearly we're in a pandemic, e-commerce has increased rapidly. Many things have happened regarding payment systems that we thought would take 10 years. So for example, grocery delivery has experienced 10 years of growth in the last 5 months. And the utilization of e-commerce, digital payments has skyrocketed and changed the way a lot of the economy is working. We'll come back to that more as we talk about the global impacts. Let's keep going. So artificial intelligence is a little bit of my background, my applied science. Maybe the thing that I'm good at or used to do is building artificial intelligence engines. The scope and capacity of these engines is even surprising to me. AlphaFold is a division within DeepMind, which is a company owned by Google. And in creating vaccines, like a CV-19 vaccine, one of the most difficult parts is, and this gets super nerdy, but it's on what's called protein folding, which is sort of forecasting how amino acids might form together to create protein structures. And it can be a very laborious process until enter AlphaFold, who has said, hey, we can use a neural network, basically artificial intelligence machine, to estimate, to predict the proteins that would come together to create the vaccine, shaving massive amounts of time and money off this process. This is just one application of AI. Let's keep going. Boston Dynamics is a company I've always found interesting. There's a great video on YouTube or anywhere you want to look about their robots. This is one, the Lima dog, and it can run around completely autonomously. It's super stable. It can run around on ice and snow and the water or whatever. So it has a number of applications, but one of them, interestingly enough, this is in Singapore. The Singapore government has outfitted this robot with speakers so that it can make announcements, and it walks around parks, and it identifies if any people are closer than 6 feet, and it walks in between them, asking them to stand further apart. So it's sort of like a patrol robot. Robots like this are being used everywhere. It's just interesting, the applications during the pandemic. Okay, Sherry. So let's think also about implications a little closer to home. I think about hospitality, which is a huge part of our economy. How will hospitality change? I know a number of folks who own hotels, and big hotel chains like Marriott and Hyatt and Hilton are clients of ours, and they're all looking at occupancy rates. One hotel group recently hit 51% occupancy last weekend, and they were so excited to crest 50%. Still not profitable, but excited to hit that mark where they had been in the 20s or 19-20% occupancy a couple months ago. So what's going to happen with hospitality? What's going to happen in restaurants, especially? So I think there'll be a lot of ghost kitchens, which, if you're not familiar with the term, that is a centralized kitchen where they prepare the food, not for anyone to eat in, but to deliver it out. That's their whole model. And we'll have potentially fewer in-house experiences. This might give rise to indoor gardening, vertical gardens, things like this that you see. Okay, let's go on. So as we think about the pandemic and spread of infections, part of the, I think the formula here is trying to figure out if contactless interactions will continue. So as we might go through scenario planning, if we, or when we have a vaccine and have widespread distribution of the vaccine, does that mean that we no longer need any social distancing? Does that mean that, great, this was a brief moment in time where we went through this social distancing, sort of like in the 1919 with the Spanish flu, and then we move beyond that, not to repeat it? Or is this a time where people go, this contactless stuff, this makes sense? I don't know the answer to that, but companies around the world are spending billions and billions of dollars implementing permanent contactless solutions. This is the Bangalore airport, where you can process the entire airport contactless, and they implemented this in 60 days. Government operated facilities are not typically known for being super proactive and super fast at implementing anything new. The fact that they were able to implement this in 60 days was pretty remarkable. Airports around the world have implemented similar capabilities, everything from being able to check your bags to, let's see, in the Tokyo airport, I believe, they can monitor and evaluate your shoes for any foreign soil or anything that might be problematic with you just walking through a tunnel. So my point is, there's a lot of money being invested in this contactless world, and to the extent it affects you as a consumer or as a business owner or operator, business executive, it's interesting to think about what this might mean for us. Okay, let's roll on. So here's a few predictions. If you click forward, Sherry, by the year 2025, we will have the computing power to replicate and upload the equivalent of a human brain. So the human brain has runs at like 10 to the 23rd power. And in just a few years, we'll be able to harness that amount of power, which we don't have today, but we will, to apply to interesting problems. And imagine if you have an artificial intelligence complex using a computer with that much brain power. Think of the problems you could solve. I think by 2030, will move around mostly in autonomous shared ownership electric vehicles. And by about 2051, we will have a computing power that is larger, more capable than all of the human brains. So this is only 31 years away. And this is a scenario where today we are smarter than a lot of computers in a lot of areas. But by 2051, we will not be. And so preparing for that. And this forecast is a mathematical forecast. It's not like a guess of what might happen, but it's a mathematical forecast looking at the rate of change and our current computing power versus the computing power required to replicate all human brains. May even happen a little faster. Okay, let's keep going. So let me give you some examples of artificial intelligence and data and insights to change the world. So a couple of these have to do with games, which maybe aren't so close to your heart, but the games represent the intelligence that can be used in other areas. So back 4 years ago, the same company, DeepMind, who created AlphaFold, created AlphaGo. And the game of Go is one where there's a matrix of intersections, right? Two lines crossing each other, and you put either a white or black stone in, and you capture your opponent's area or they capture yours. Pretty simple rules, but there are more potential moves in a standard game of Go than there are atoms in the universe, which seems ridiculous, but it's true. So when Google bought this company, DeepMind, Sergey Brin, who's one of the founders, was talking to the DeepMind founders and said, I like what you guys are doing, but you'll never win at this game Go. It's just too complicated. There's too much of it. But in March of 2016, AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol, who is one of the grandmasters. And they did it, the machine, DeepMind, won by making a move that no one had ever seen before. And so the point there was, it felt like the machine reached a level of intelligence that was beyond just being trained. It created its own knowledge outside of its training. And this seems kind of science fiction and kind of silly maybe, but machines today are able to create their own knowledge set on their own. I'll tell you more about that and hopefully show you that that's true. Let's keep going. So in 2017, Carnegie Mellon has a machine called Libratus, and it beat 4 professional poker players in No Limit Texas Hold'em. If any of you are poker players, you know that in Texas Hold'em, as well as other poker games, there's an element of bluffing and of trying to read your opponent. You're also calculating probability of your set of cards being the winning hand. But the theory was for many years that a machine or an AI machine could never win at poker because of the bluffing element. That was the domain of humans only. And yet Libratus beat these 4 players and has gone on to completely decimate professional poker players. So let's go. Hopefully they're not across the craps table from you. So this is a little example from some of the work that we do at Merits, and we use artificial intelligence machines to do things like predicting what people will buy and what they would like. So we run loyalty programs as an example, and HSBC is one of our clients. So we see all the credit card transactions and everything like that, and use our AI engine to predict what will you buy, what would you like, how should our client HSBC treat you as a customer, because you really want to be treated as an individual. I don't want to be treated as a big herd of people. I want you to see me as someone special and individual. And that's what we deployed, and it's seen massive success. So that's just an application of these types of predictive models and AI engines, helping you get closer and more targeted with your customers, your clients. Okay, let's carry on. So if you've heard of Alan Turing, there was a movie about him, and the Turing test is really the gold standard in determining if a computer has achieved the equivalent to a human. So I thought we could do our own little Turing test here. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear one piece of music that was clearly created by a person, and then we're going to hear two more, and we're going to see if you, the audience, can figure out which one was created by a machine versus a person. So let's hear that first song, the Vivaldi movement. So if you've ever been to a wedding, that you probably recognize that Four Seasons movement. So if we could, Sherry, thank you. Let's go and play the second movement. So like I said, we're going to play two other pieces. One was created by a machine, originally created by a machine, and one was not. And so we'll do a poll at the end of this to see if you can identify which one was created by the machine. Okay, that was the second, and now we'll have the third. We're making Sherry really earn her pay today. Okay, I apologize that the audio is kind of coming in and out, but hopefully you get the gist. So now we have a poll, so you can estimate which one you feel like was, which of the following was created by a machine, the second or third movement.
Okay, I'll leave it open a few more seconds here.
Right. We've got a majority of the folks the voting in. So what's interesting, 56% said the third was created by the machine. I'll tell you what I think is most interesting about this is how split this was. I mean, this is almost a 50-50 estimate, which would suggest that it's really just not that clear. If you're a competitive sort, the answer was the second movement was created by the machine. And it was created by a program called Emmy, who was made by a guy named David Cope, who's both a musician and a computer scientist. Let's go on. So part of the point there is that even in the domain of creating something artistic, machines can do as good, maybe even better job than people. And this was thought to be the last bastion of what people are really good at, something creative that you have to feel. So let's talk about where this takes us. Let's go on. So we're entering into a place of autonomous automation. What I mean by that is automation we typically think of as something that people do. I'm going to automate this system. It will no longer be manual, but a machine will do it. Autonomous automation is the machine identifies what needs to be automated and does it on its own without a person ever having to be involved. So let's go to the next page and we'll talk about some examples of this. This is, if you click one more right, Anduril. Anduril actually is a reference to a sword in The Lord of the Rings. In 2018, Palmer Luckey, who was he was the gentleman who started Oculus that was bought by Facebook for $2 billion. I think when Palmer was like 19 years old, it was purchased. He's at 27 today. They've created, this is a system that is launched along the border between the US and Mexico. And he popped up a bunch of cheap electronic equipment, connected it to his AI machine, and the cameras just look out across the horizon looking for stuff. They're not programmed on what they're looking for, but they identify trees and whatnot and are looking for people and cars. If you go to the next slide, Sherry, part of what's really interesting about this is everything was really cheap. He took a laser from a hair removal device, said, yeah, this laser will work, and it costs, you know, $8, and I'm going to attach it to all this. His equipment is like 5% of the similar equipment that other companies were trying to build. And so he deployed this in a matter of a few months. In June or July of this year, this company raised another $200 million from Andreessen Horowitz. They are building out all sorts of autonomous capabilities, things like drones and anti-drone capabilities. If you heard about Saudi Arabia's oil pipeline being disrupted by little drones, he's trying to counteract that. Let's go on, we'll give you another example. Alphago Zero. So I mentioned DeepMind creating Alphago to play the game Go. And that was one where a bunch of scientists got together and helped train this artificial intelligence machine. This time they created Alphago Zero. It's an algorithm, but they gave it no instructions. They didn't even tell it what the rules of the game were. It just played itself, and it beat AlphaGo in 40 days. So this is an example of a machine teaching itself what to do and trouncing something that humans built. All right, let's keep going. So augmented reality is something that's quite interesting, and it's been around for a number of years. We're moving from augmented reality to computer vision. So let's go to the next page, and I'll give you an example of what that might mean. Sherry's gonna play a video for us. This is, it's gonna be a little jerky, and I apologize. It's not actually that jerky, but through the GoToWebinar, it gets a little tricky. So what's happening here is a computer is just evaluating some video, and in real time, it's identifying, what do I see? I see a person, a backpack, a dog, I see some skis. In real time. Oh, look, I see bulls, I see people, I see a table. We are creating a map of the world, actual size, which is a phrase I think is funny, right? We don't create maps that are actual size, but in the digital world, you can, because we can map everything. And that's what computers are doing. We have cameras everywhere. We're building a map of the entire world, and the computers are able to identify what lives amongst us. Okay, let's keep going. So this is my last couple of pages. I have a note on our global competitive position. So as I mentioned when I kicked off, my goal here is just to provide a point of view, maybe some insights that you hadn't seen before, because I want people in my area, in St. Louis, in the Midwest region, but in the entire United States, to be as competitive as we can possibly be, because we're not really competing with the company down the street or the company in the state, one state over. We're competing on a global stage. China is likely to be the dominant AI provider to the world. And I say this because the data that they have is massively larger than the data any US company has. Despite the antitrust allegations against Google and Facebook and whatnot, companies like Tencent and Alibaba have mountains more data. So if you click ahead just a little bit, they have almost 1 billion daily active users on WeChat. Uber and Lyft had 4.4 billion. This is in 2017. Currently they have fewer now, but in 2017 they had 4.4 billion rides. Didi had 7.3. And if you click one more, Sherry. So in 2016, which is the most recent data I could get, the US had $112 billion in mobile payments. Now that certainly has gone up now, but if the US had 112 billion, now keep in mind our economy is 20, $21 billion. China is more like 14. We're gonna launch a poll. How much in mobile payments do you think China had in that same year, 2016? Okay, votes are coming in fast.
I'm gonna close it here in 2 seconds.
No problem. Okay, few people are going for 250 billion. So 1 trillion, 5 trillion, closer to $10 trillion. So if we go to that next page, this is the last one. Because China allows these two companies to operate with government support. In China, it's very difficult to pay for anything with cash. It's more difficult to pay with credit card. Using your mobile device is how people, not only consumers buy everything, but people buy, businesses buy things. So people are buying dump trucks, capital equipment on their mobile device. So Alibaba and Tencent can see where you are, exactly what you purchased for exactly how much, who the two counterparties were. They have orders of magnitude more data about each one of their people. And they can use that data to mine it and build AI engines to a much greater extent. In the US, there's no company that has a similar amount of data to those two companies, because we have a lot of regulation about privacy, about separating data, about PII, and there's no dominant company like those two. You might have your credit card with Chase or American Express or Bank of America, but you might have your bank account somewhere else. You don't have all your funds going through your mobile payments. So not one person sees everything you do. Not the same in China. And so we need to just be vigilant about the data assets that we have, the way we're mining those insights and creating value for our clients and customers. Okay, I went a couple of minutes over, but that brings us to a close. And I believe the plan is to open up for some questions.
Yes. We've had a couple of questions sent in. First and foremost, what would disrupt progress towards artificial intelligence dominance?
Yeah, so I've had a number of conversations with folks who have said, gosh, this kind of feels a little dystopian. Like, is this really what's going to happen? And surely not. How do we make this not happen? And we've talked about things like privacy. Well, privacy is important to us here in the US, and certainly this was actually before the pandemic. Surely privacy concerns would keep us from pursuing this path where companies know everything about us and they have predictive models that can predict everything we do or will do. But my assertion prior to the pandemic was that privacy will not hold us back. There is actually nothing that will curtail this evolution of artificial intelligence. The snowball has started rolling down the hill, and it's not going to stop. But since the pandemic, privacy concerns have actually gone up, and violations of privacy have also gone up. If we think about contact tracing, right? That was something we would never have done before the pandemic, and yet, well, when push comes to shove, we go, yeah, okay, sure. Here's my phone. Here's everyone I've contacted. Here's everywhere I've gone. Yep, I guess I have to let you do that. All the facial recognition. If you think about contactless processing through an airport, they use facial recognition for a lot of that, iris identification. So, you're now faced with a choice of, well, would you like to potentially have this violation of privacy, or would you like to touch a bunch of stuff and potentially get a virus? And I think the ease of use of being able to just walk through a quick tunnel in an airport that validates you and does all the security and everything will win over the privacy concerns. Mm-hmm. So in my opinion, the snowball can't be unrolled and pushed back up the mountain.
Okay. So is there a way to monetize our own privacy?
There are a number of companies who have come out and said, your privacy, your personal data has value, and so you should, many of us give that away, and so I certainly know I have two boys that are 11 and 13, and they're perfectly willing to give away any sort of personal data in order just to get like a free game. They're cheap, but many adults are pretty cheap as well. Trading off a lot of personal data just for simplicity. So I'll give you an example. If you've ever logged into a website and used your Facebook credentials, for example, right? You are giving up a ton of privacy every time you do that, because Facebook is vacuuming up all of that information, and they want to know exactly where you're going and when, how long you spend there. And when you log in with Facebook, it gives them that information. So they then assemble that into all the absurd time you spend looking through your Facebook feed. And they have a dossier on you that's better than the CIA. That's just one example. I don't allow anyone in my family to use Google, Facebook, or any other authentication tools, because I really don't want one company tracking me. But there are alternatives where these companies say, hey, I will help you monetize your data. So then you can pick, I want to sell this amount of data, but not this other, and I'll sell it for this amount to this person for these uses. So I think there could be ways to monetize the data. I haven't seen those really take off, because they're kind of a pain. And I think, you know, for the $5 you might get for your data, it feels like kind of a big lift for people who are busy. So I'm not sure. Maybe that will happen, but it's got to be easier.
Yeah, I'll tell you, there's nothing creepier than when you're talking about a vacation or where you want to go, and then all of a sudden in your Facebook feed starts coming these opportunities for traveling to that place that you were just talking about. And my husband blames it on our Alexa and says that she's listening at all times.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I'm not sure that Alexa will provide the data to Facebook. You know, Amazon, Facebook aren't tight buddies. However, a lot of people aren't aware that Gmail mines all the content in every email you send or receive, and they use that. So I use Gmail very sparingly because of that. But I have a Google Home device and a couple Alexa devices, and we unplug them frequently. That's also because I have two boys who can be like wild monsters, you know, fighting over using the thing. But it's also because, you know, I'm just not sure how much of that's being collected and used. And gosh, I just don't. It's like having a stranger sit in my living room when my wife and I are having a conversation. Like, that feels kind of creepy.
Yes. So we did get a question regarding, it says, considering the current economic environment, how in the world would a company rebuild itself now? You know, as far as is business transformation, what's driving those decisions? How do you do that in a pandemic?
Yeah, I agree. So I think, and you know, by the way, I want to take a minute. UHY has a great service on digital transformation. And so if you've, you know, I'm not a pitch man for UHY, but if you've got questions about what to do, I think, you know, going to a professional service provider could be a great way to get some advice on what can I do, what are my options, how much will it cost, things like that. But here's my take. Digital transformation is a term, maybe it's used too much. Maybe I should back off that. But it doesn't mean I have to do, you know, rebuild my company. You can. That's sort of an option, but I don't know anyone that has gone that approach. But I would guess if you looked around your company and you could identify a handful, a dozen, 2 dozen initiatives that would start to work around the edges. So what I prefer, there's an engineering approach called the Strangler Method. That means I'm going to take one small atomic function, and I'm going to change the way it works. I'm not going to try to change the whole system. I'm just going to change this one thing that's kind of discrete, and I'm going to make it work better. I'm going to provide more insights, or I'm going to monetize some data, or whatever. And then I'm going to use that as an example, and then I'm going to go to the next one and make it work a little better. So my suggestion would be to kind of take inventory. And the way I like to suggest folks that to take inventory is to think about things like, in what processes do we use rules of thumb or an estimate? And in my own company, we have a warehouse, and we had just like folklore that said, we need $10 million, I'm making up the number. We need $10 million of inventory in our warehouse in order to provide customer service levels that we expect. And during the pandemic, I said, hey, you know that idea that we need 10 million? Why is it 10 million? Because cash flow matters right now a lot. So if I can make that 7 million, I got an extra 3 million of cash flow. And it turned out, you know, whoever had decided that retired 15 years ago. No one could remember. No one even knew. And it turns out we're doing fine with 5 million. So there's a number of things that the smoke that might represent some fire is, where are we using rules of thumb to make decisions? Where do we have insights that our clients or our consumers would benefit from, but we're not providing? So in the example with HSBC, you know, all we needed to do was mine the data that we had that said, oh, here's how I can surprise and delight each consumer on an individual basis. I just have to look at what they've been doing, apply a little algorithm. And if you don't have the internal capabilities to build an algorithm, you know, you can go to you can rent or buy that from someone else. It's not that expensive. So even as short as 3 years ago, it was probably 5 times more expensive than it is today, because today the tools are so ubiquitous, so good. You can, for 50 grand, you can have somebody build an algorithm for you. The price where it used to be 500 grand.
Okay. All right. And as I look at the clock, we're approaching the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time and give you an opportunity to get on with your day and jump on your next virtual meeting. Thank you, Drew, so much for joining us this morning. You gave us some really, really great things to think about and some good ideas to help us move forward and innovate within our own companies.
Absolutely.
I want to say also thank everyone for joining us today. Next month on September 16th, we'll have an individual from our UHY corporate finance team that's going to be talking about M&A during COVID. So be sure to mark your calendars and join us then. And as a reminder, I have recorded today's presentation, and we'll share a link with you afterwards to where you can go back and watch what Drew shared and maybe take some additional notes. So with that being said, thank you, Drew, and thank you everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful week.
Happy Tuesday.
Bye, guys.